Before we begin the story, let us know where you're watching from by leaving a comment below. If you enjoy this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. Have a wonderful day. Enjoy the story, everyone. Evan Harper had never touched a woman, not romantically, not intimately, not even a casual brush of fingers when passing someone on the street. At 28, he was worth $500 million and could buy anything in the world except the courage to look a beautiful woman in the eye without his hands trembling. The contract on his mahogany desk changed everything. Surrogate services agreement. It read in cold, clinical typography, for the express purpose of producing an heir to the Harper family fortune. His parents had orchestrated this before leaving for their 6-month European expansion tour, setting everything in motion while Evan was distracted by a major software launch. Now, someone was coming to his door. The soft chime of his private elevator sent ice through Evan's veins. He stood frozen in his home office, surrounded by the blue glow of computer screens that had been his constant companions. His fingers, usually so confident on keyboards, now trembled as he reached for his coffee mug. The ceramic slipped, shattering against the marble floor in a symphony of destruction that seemed to announce the end of his carefully constructed isolation. "Damn," he whispered, his voice rusty from conducting business meetings via video conference for the past month. His company ran smoothly through his brilliant team and automated systems, but Evan's personal isolation had grown worse since his parents left. The elevator chimed again, followed by the soft whisper of doors opening. Evan's heart hammered against his ribs as footsteps echoed across his foyer light. Feminine steps that seemed to dance across the polished marble. His building's concierge had strict instructions to announce all visitors, but the contract had included override codes for this specific situation. "Mr. Harper," the voice was like warm honey poured over velvet, rich and melodious with just a hint of nervousness that made something deep in Evan's chest tighten. "I'm Lila Bennett. I believe your parents arranged for me to come." Lila Bennett, the name from the contract, the woman hired to give him a child. Evan closed his eyes, fighting the panic that threatened to overwhelm him. His therapist had warned him this day would come when his parents would stop accepting his excuses about focusing on business and start taking matters into their own hands. He just hadn't expected it to happen like this. "Mr. Harper," she called again, her voice closer now. "I know this is awkward, but perhaps we could talk. I drove all the way from Brooklyn in this storm." Something in her tone, a mixture of determination and vulnerability, made Evan open his eyes. Through the crack in his office door, he caught his first glimpse of her. She was breathtaking. Lila Bennett stood in his foyer like a goddess who had accidentally wandered into a tech mogul's sterile domain. Her natural hair framed a face that belonged in Renaissance painting-shy cheekbones, full lips that curved in an uncertain smile, and the most expressive brown eyes Evan had ever seen. She wore a simple black dress that hugged curves in all the right places. And when she shifted nervously from foot to foot, Evan felt something stir in him that he'd never experienced before. Raw, electric attraction. His mouth went dry, his palms began to sweat, every muscle in his body tensed as if preparing for flight, though he couldn't decide if he wanted to run toward her or away from her. "I know you're here," Lila said gently, setting a small purse on his coffee table. "Your parents explained that you're shy. I want you to know I'm not here to judge you or pressure you into anything you're not comfortable with." Evan pressed harder against the wall, wishing he could disappear entirely. How was he supposed to have a conversation with this woman? How was he supposed to look at her without stammering like a teenager? How was he supposed to explain that, despite being worth $500 million, he'd never even held hands with a woman, let alone done what his parents were expecting him to do? "I have the contract here," Lila continued, pulling a manila folder from her purse. "It specifies a 6-month arrangement with specific expectations. But honestly, I'd rather just talk first, get to know each other before we worry about business arrangements." She moved further into his living room, and Evan watched her take in his space, the minimalist furniture, the wall of windows overlooking Central Park, the complete absence of personal touches that might indicate a human being actually lived here. Her expression was curious rather than judgmental, which somehow made everything worse. "I studied literature at Columbia," she said conversationally, as if she were chatting with an old friend rather than talking to an empty room. "I love books, rainy afternoons, and terrible romantic comedies. I'm probably the only person in New York who still writes in a paper journal instead of typing everything on a computer. Despite his terror, Evan found himself leaning closer to the door crack. Her voice was hypnotic, drawing him in despite every instinct screaming at him to hide. I'm also broke, Lila admitted with a rueful laugh. My mother has stage 3 cancer, and the medical bills are destroying our family. The contract offers enough money to save her life, which is why I'm here, Mr. Harper. Not because I'm some kind of professional. I'm just a graduate student desperate enough to answer a very unusual classified ad. The honesty in her voice hit Evan like a physical blow. She wasn't here because she wanted to be. She was here because she needed to be. Just like he was hiding because he needed to hide. Evan took a shaky breath and stepped away from the wall. His reflection in the window showed him what Lila would see if he revealed himself. A tall, lean man with dark hair that hadn't been cut in months, wearing a wrinkled Harvard t-shirt and jeans that had seen better days. He looked exactly like what he was, a reclusive millionaire who had forgotten how to interact with the world. "Miss Bennett," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Lila turned toward the sound, her face lighting up with relief and something that might have been genuine pleasure. "There you are. Please, call me Lila." Evan stepped into the doorway but remained frozen there, gripping the frame like a lifeline. When their eyes met across the room, something electric passed between them, a jolt of recognition that had nothing to do with the contract and everything to do with the way she looked at him, not with pity or calculation, but with simple human warmth. "This is terrifying," Evan admitted, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. Lila smiled, and the expression transformed her entire face. "For both of us," she agreed, "but maybe we could be terrified together over dinner. I noticed you have an amazing kitchen that looks like it's never been used." Despite everything, Evan felt his lips twitch upward in what might have been his first genuine smile in months. "I mostly order takeout," he confessed. "Perfect," Lila said, moving toward his kitchen with easy confidence. "I love to cook. Why don't you tell me what you like to eat, and I'll see what I can do with whatever's in your refrigerator." As Evan watched her open his pristine stainless steel refrigerator and begin pulling out ingredients he'd forgotten he owned, he realized his life had just changed forever. The woman in his kitchen wasn't just here to fulfill a contract, she was here to pull him back into the world of the living. Chapter 2. Breaking the Ice. Evan couldn't sleep for 3 nights straight. He'd lain in his king-sized bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of dinner with Lila, the way she'd hummed while cooking, completely at ease in his sterile kitchen, how she'd drawn him into conversation with questions about his work, his interests, his dreams, as if he were a normal person worthy of genuine curiosity. But it was the moment she touched his hand that haunted him most. When he'd reached for the salt at the same time she did, their fingers had brushed for maybe 3 seconds that had sent lightning through his entire nervous system, making him jerk back so violently he'd nearly knocked over his wine glass. Lila had apologized as if she'd done something wrong, but Evan had seen the flash of hurt in her beautiful brown eyes. Now it was Monday morning, and she was in his library. Evan stood outside the doorway like a teenager with his first crush, gathering the courage to enter his own house. Through the crack, he could see Lila curled up in his favorite reading chair, her legs tucked beneath her, completely absorbed in a worn copy of Jane Eyre. She'd changed from yesterday's dress into jeans and a soft cream sweater that made her skin glow, and her natural hair caught the morning sunlight streaming through the tall windows. She was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen in his sterile, lonely world. "You can come in, you know," Lila said without looking up from her book, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "I don't bite." Evan's face burned with embarrassment at being caught staring. "I didn't want to disturb your reading," he mumbled, stepping hesitantly into the room that had been his private sanctuary for years. "You're not disturbing me," Lila assured him, finally glancing up. When their eyes met, Evan felt that same electric jolt from the previous evening. "I was just thinking how incredible your library is. Most people with collections like this treat them as decoration." "I've read them all," Evan admitted, moving closer despite his nervousness. "Some of them multiple times." Lila's face lit up with genuine delight. "Really? Even the Bronte sisters?" "Especially the Bronte sisters," Evan said, surprised by his own boldness. Emily was a genius, but Charlotte understood passion in a way that was revolutionary for her time. The words tumbled out before he could stop them, and Evan immediately regretted speaking. Lila was probably just being polite. Who wanted to hear a reclusive millionaire ramble about Victorian literature? But instead of looking bored, Lila set down her book and leaned forward with obvious interest. "What do you think about Rochester?" she asked. "Is he a romantic hero, or just a manipulative older man taking advantage of Jane's inexperience?" For the next hour, they debated literature with an intensity that made Evan forget his shyness. Lila was brilliant, not just educated, but genuinely passionate about books and ideas. She challenged his interpretations, made him see familiar stories from new angles, and laughed at his dry observations in a way that made his chest feel warm and tight. "You should be teaching," Evan said when their conversation naturally paused. "You have insights that would inspire students." Lila's smile faltered slightly. "That's the plan, eventually, once I finish my dissertation and find a position. But right now," she gestured vaguely, and Evan remembered why she was here: the medical bills, the 6-month contract his parents had arranged, the desperation that had brought her to answer their advertisement. "Your mother," Evan said gently. "How is she responding to treatment?" "Stage 3, breast cancer," Lila replied, her voice carefully controlled. "The treatment is experimental and expensive, but the doctors think there's a real chance of remission if we can afford to continue." The pain in her voice made Evan's chest ache. He wanted to fix this for her, to write a check that would solve all her problems, but he sensed that would only make her feel worse about their arrangement. "Tell me about her," he said instead. "What's she like?" Lila's face softened as she began describing her Mathera retired teacher who'd raised Lila alone, who still volunteered at literacy programs despite her illness, who worried more about her daughter's future than her own prognosis. As she spoke, Evan found himself leaning closer, drawn not just by her words but by the way her eyes sparkled when she talked about someone she loved. "She'd like you," Lila said suddenly. "She always said the best men are the ones who read books and actually think about what they mean." Evan's heart skipped several beats. "She knows about this arrangement?" "God, no." Lila laughed, a sound like wind chimes that made Evan's stomach flutter. "She thinks I'm house-sitting for a wealthy family while they're traveling. If she knew the truth." Lila shook her head. "She raised me to believe in love, in waiting for the right person. This would break her heart." The admission hung between them, heavy with implications. Evan wanted to say something comforting, but he didn't trust his voice. Instead, he stood abruptly and moved to his piano in the corner of the library. "Do you play?" Lila asked, following him with her eyes. "A little," Evan said, which was a massive understatement. Music had been his escape, even before computers, a way to express emotions he couldn't voice. His fingers found the keys automatically, beginning a piece he'd composed last year during a particularly lonely winter. The melody was melancholy but beautiful, filled with longing and unspoken dreams. As Evan played, he became lost in the music, forgetting Lila was watching, forgetting to be self-conscious about sharing something so personal. The notes flowed through him like a confession, telling the story of a man who'd built walls so high he'd forgotten what it felt like to let someone in. When the last note faded, Evan remained frozen at the piano, afraid to look at Lila's reaction. What if she thought his music was pretentious? "That was beautiful," Lila whispered, and Evan turned to find her standing just behind him, close enough that he could smell her perfume, something warm and subtle that made his head spin. "Did you compose it?" Evan nodded, not trusting his voice. Lila was so close he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes, could count her long lashes, could notice the way her lips parted slightly as she breathed. "It sounded like loneliness," she said softly, "but also like hope, like someone waiting for something beautiful to happen." Their eyes locked, and Evan felt the air between them charged with electricity. Lila's gaze dropped to his mouth for just a second before meeting his eyes again, and Evan's heart hammered against his ribs. She was going to kiss him. He could see it in her expression, in the way she swayed slightly closer. Panic seized him. Evan jerked backward so violently that the piano bench scraped across the hardwood floor. I have work to do," he stammered, practically running from the room. Behind him, he heard Lila's sigh, but she didn't follow. When he reached his office, Evan slammed the door and pressed his back against it, breathing hard. His entire body was shaking from that moment of almost contact, from the wanting that had nearly overwhelmed his fear. For the rest of the day, Evan hid in his office like a coward, ordering lunch to be delivered and communicating with Lila only through awkward text messages. But even with a door between them, he could feel her presence in his house, like a beautiful disruption to his carefully ordered world. That evening, when he finally emerged for dinner, Lila acted as if nothing had happened. She'd cooked again, something that smelled incredible, and chatted easily about books, current events, anything except the moment by the piano, when they'd almost crossed a line neither of them was ready to acknowledge. But Evan noticed the way she was careful not to touch him when passing dishes. He noticed how she kept her distance when they moved around the kitchen. Most of all, he noticed the hurt she was trying to hide behind her smile. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling again, Evan realized he was falling for Lila Bennett. The woman his parents had hired to give him an heir was becoming something far more dangerous, someone he actually cared about. And that terrified him more than anything else in his carefully controlled world. Chapter 3. Walls Coming Down. "You can't live your entire life in this penthouse," Lila announced on Thursday morning, standing in Evan's doorway with her hands on her hips and determination blazing in her eyes. "When's the last time you experienced unfiltered sunlight?" Evan looked up from his laptop, where he'd been hiding behind code for the past hour, trying not to think about how Lila's morning routine had become the highlight of his day, the way she hummed while making coffee, how she always saved him the last piece of toast, the unconscious grace with which she moved through his space as if she belonged there. "I get plenty of vitamin D from supplements," Evan said weakly, minimizing the video conference window where his CTO was updating him on their latest project. His company's brilliant team had learned to function with his remote leadership style, but even they were starting to notice his increased distraction. "And the UV rays are actually harmful." "Get dressed," Lila interrupted, moving into his office with that confident stride that made his pulse quicken. "We're going to Central Park." "I don't do parks," Evan protested, even as his treacherous body responded to her proximity. She was wearing a sundress today, something yellow and flowing that made her skin glow like warm honey. "Too many people, too many variables." "Exactly," Lila smiled, and Evan felt his resolve crumbling like a house of cards. "You need variables, Evan. You need chaos and noise, and the beautiful messiness of real life." 20 minutes later, Evan found himself walking down Fifth Avenue beside the most beautiful woman he'd ever seen, wondering how she'd managed to convince him to leave his sanctuary. The city assaulted his scent scar horns, construction noise, the smell of hot dogs and exhaust, but somehow, with Lila's hand tucked into the crook of his elbow, it felt manageable. "See," Lila said as they entered the park, "the world didn't end." Evan was about to reply when Lila suddenly stopped walking, her attention caught by an ice cream vendor. "Oh my God, it's been years since I've had a good ice cream cone. Do you want one?" Before Evan could protest that he didn't eat sugar or dairy or food from questionable street vendors, Lila was already ordering 2 cones of vanilla ice cream. She handed him one with such obvious pleasure that Evan found himself accepting it despite his better judgment. "Thank you," he said, unsure what to do with the rapidly melting dessert. Lila had no such hesitation. She took a long, slow lick of her ice cream, her pink tongue darting out to catch a drop that threatened to escape down the side of the cone. Evan watched, mesmerized, as she closed her eyes in apparent bliss. She sighed. "Perfect." Evan nearly dropped his cone. The sound she'd made was innocently sensual, but it sent heat rushing through his body like liquid fire. He tried to take a bite of his own ice cream, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold it steady. "You okay?" Lila asked, noticing his distress. "Fine," Evan managed, his voice coming out rougher than intended. "Just not used to this." They found a bench overlooking the lake, and for the next hour, Lila entertained him with stories about her childhood in Detroit, her dreams of teaching, her mother's outrageous opinions about modern literature. Evan found himself laughing, actually laughing for the first time in months. Lila's joy was infectious, pulling him out of his shell despite his determination to stay safely hidden. "You have a beautiful laugh," Lila said suddenly. her voice soft with something that might have been affection. "You should do it more often." Evan felt heat creep up his neck. "I don't have much to laugh about, usually." "Maybe you just need the right company," Lila suggested, and when Evan looked at her, he found her watching him with an expression that made his heart stutter. Dark clouds had been gathering while they talked, and suddenly the sky opened up in a torrential downpour. Other park visitors scattered, running for shelter, but Evan and Lila were caught in the open with nowhere to go. "This way!" Lila grabbed Evan's hand, pulling him toward a small pavilion 50 yards away. They ran through the rain together, Lila laughing like a child while Evan focused on the feel of her fingers interlaced with his. By the time they reached shelter, they were both soaked through. Lila's yellow dress clung to her curves, and her hair hung in dark tendrils around her face. She looked like a goddess emerging from a river, wild and beautiful and completely unself-conscious. Evan, meanwhile, felt like a drowned rat. "That was amazing," Lila exclaimed, wringing water from her hair. "I love summer storms." Evan was staring. He couldn't help it. The wet fabric of her dress revealed the outline of her body in ways that made his mouth go dry and his blood burn. When Lila noticed his gaze, her cheeks flushed pink, but she didn't look away. "You're staring," she whispered. "I'm sorry," Evan started to say, but Lila stepped closer, cutting off his apology. "Don't apologize," she said softly. "I like the way you look at me." Evan's breath caught in his throat. They were only inches apart now, close enough that he could see water droplets clinging to her eyelashes. Could feel the warmth radiating from her body despite the cool rain. "Lila," he whispered, her name a prayer on his lips. She moved even closer, rising on her tiptoes, her face tilted up toward his. "It's okay, Evan. You can touch me." For a moment, Evan was paralyzed by want. Every cell in his body screamed at him to kiss her. To finally cross the line they'd been dancing around for days. But then panic seized him again. What if he did it wrong? What if she realized how inexperienced he was? What if a crack of thunder made them both jump, breaking the spell? Evan stepped back, running, shaking hands through his wet hair. "We should go back," he said, his voice barely steady. "You'll catch cold." Disappointment flashed across Lila's face before she masked it with a smile. "Of course. You're probably right." The walk back to his building was quiet, both of them lost in their own thoughts. In the elevator, Evan stood as far from Lila as possible, not trusting himself to maintain control if she got too close again. But he could feel her watching him, could sense her hurt and confusion at his rejection. Back in the penthouse, Lila excused herself to change into dry clothes while Evan did the same. When they met again in the kitchen for dinner, both of them had retreated behind careful politeness, as if the moment in the pavilion had never happened. "I thought I'd make pasta tonight," Lila said, keeping her voice deliberately light. "Something simple." "That sounds perfect," Evan replied, grateful for the normalcy of routine. But cooking together proved to be its own form of torture. The kitchen forced them into close proximity, and every accidental brush of hands or arms sent electricity shooting through Evan's nervous system. When Lila needed something from the cabinet above his head, she had to reach across him, her breasts pressing briefly against his back. Evan bit back a groan, his knuckles white as he gripped the counter. "Sorry," Lila murmured, but her voice was breathless, and Evan could feel her trembling too. The real test came when Lila was making the sauce and somehow managed to get flour in her hair. Without thinking, Evan reached up to brush it away, his fingers tangling in her soft curls. Lila went perfectly still at his touch, her eyes closing as if savoring the contact. "Evan," she whispered, and the way she said his name like a prayer, like a plenarly, shattered his control entirely. He was going to kiss her. Every rational thought fled his mind as he cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking across her cheekbones. Lila's lips parted in invitation, her hands coming up to rest on his chest. Then the smoke alarm went off. They sprang apart, both of them breathing hard as Lila rushed to turn off the burner where the sauce had begun to burn. Evan stood frozen, watching her move around the kitchen with quick efficiency, his body still humming with unfulfilled desire. "Crisis averted," Lila said with forced cheerfulness, but Evan could see the hurt in her eyes. 2 almost kisses in one day, and he'd ruined both of them. That night, Evan lay in bed, replaying every moment, every touch, every look that had passed between them. His body ached with want, but his mind was a battlefield of fear and longing. He was falling for Lila had already fallen, if he was honest, but his terror of intimacy was stronger than his desire. Down the hall, Lila was probably lying awake too, wondering why the man who looked at her like she was the most beautiful thing in the world kept pulling away every time she got close. Evan closed his eyes, knowing that tomorrow would bring more of the same exquisite torture, more moments of connection followed by his inevitable retreat, more proof that he was too damaged, too broken to deserve someone as incredible as Lila Bennett. But God help him, he didn't want her to leave. Chapter 4. The First Touch. Evan woke to the sound of coughing. At first, he thought he was dreaming. In the weeks since their rain-soaked afternoon in Central Park, he'd become accustomed to the soft sounds of Lila moving through his penthouse, her morning humming, the gentle clink of dishes, the whisper of pages turning when she read in his library. But this was different, harsh. Painful coughs that seemed to tear from her throat. He found her in the kitchen, doubled over the sink, her body shaking with each violent spasm. She was still in her pajamas, a simple white cotton set that somehow looked elegant on her. But her usual grace was gone, replaced by the unsteady movements of someone fighting illness. Lila, Evan approached cautiously, his heart clenching at the sight of her distress. Are you okay? She turned toward him, and Evan felt his chest tighten with worry. Her beautiful brown eyes were glassy with fever. Her cheeks flushed unnaturally bright against her dark skin. When she tried to speak, another coughing fit seized her, leaving her gasping for breath. I'm fine, she managed to whisper. But the lie was obvious even to someone as socially inexperienced as Evan. Just a little cold. You're burning up, Evan said, and without thinking, he pressed the back of his hand to her forehead. The moment his skin touched hers, everything changed. The contact was electric, but not in the usual way that made him panic and retreat. This was different, protective, tender, necessary. Lila's skin was scorching beneath his fingers, confirming what he already knew. She had a serious fever, and she was trying to hide it from him. You need to be in bed, Evan said firmly, surprised by his own authority. Now, I was going to make breakfast, Lila protested weakly, but she swayed on her feet, and Evan instinctively reached out to steady her. His hands found her waist, and through the thin cotton of her pajamas, he could feel the heat radiating from her body. She felt so small, so fragile, and the fierce protectiveness that surged through him was unlike anything he'd ever experienced. The only thing you're making is yourself sicker, Evan said, guiding her gently toward the guest bedroom where she'd been staying. Come on. Lila didn't have the strength to argue. She leaned into Evan's support, her head falling against his shoulder as they walked slowly down the hall. The simple trust of the gesture, the way she allowed him to take care of her, made Evan's throat tight with emotion. In her bedroom, Evan helped her settle under the covers, his movements careful and reverent. When Lila immediately began shivering despite the fever, Evan pulled the blankets up to her chin, his fingers brushing her neck as he tucked the fabric around her. I'll be right back, he promised, and for the first time since she'd arrived, leaving her side felt physically painful. Evan had never taken care of anyone in his life. His parents had always hired professionals when he was sick, maintaining their emotional distance even during his childhood illnesses. But now, faced with Lila's vulnerability, instincts he didn't know he possessed took over. He returned with a thermometer, a glass of water, and fever reducer from his meticulously stocked medicine cabinet. Lila's temperature was 102, 3 degrees Fahrenheit, high enough to warrant serious concern. We should call the doctor, Evan said, already reaching for his phone. No. Lila grabbed his wrist with surprising strength, her fingers circling his arm like a brand. Please, I can't afford emergency room bills, and it's just the flu. I'll be fine in a few days. The mention of money made Evan's chest ache. Here she was, sick and feverish, still worrying about medical expenses when he could afford the best care in the city without thinking twice. Money isn't, he started to say, but Lila's eyes were already drifting closed, the fever pulling her under. For the next 3 days, Evan barely left her side. He worked from his laptop in the chair beside her bed, monitoring her breathing while he coded. The irony wasn't lost on him. He could manage a multi-million-dollar company remotely, but watching Lila sleep peacefully was the most important task he'd ever undertaken. He cooked simple soups, though his culinary skills were limited to following online recipes with obsessive precision. When Lila was awake enough to eat, he would sit beside her on the bed, gently spooning broth between her lips, his heart clenching every time she managed a grateful smile. "You don't have to do this," she whispered, after he'd spent 20 minutes convincing her to eat half a bowl of chicken soup. "I want to," Evan replied, surprised by the vehemence in his voice. "I need to." The most intimate moment came on the second evening, when Lila's fever spiked dangerously high, and she was too weak to protest his help. Evan ran a lukewarm bath, his hands shaking as he tested the water temperature again and again. When he returned to the bedroom, Lila was shivering despite the fever, her pajamas soaked with perspiration. "I need to get you cooled down," Evan said gently. "The bath will help." Lila nodded weakly, and Evan felt his face burn as he realized what he was offering to do. But this wasn't about desire or attraction. This was about saving the woman he was falling in love with. With infinite care, Evan helped Lila to the bathroom, supporting her weight when her legs threatened to give out. He turned away as she undressed, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, every instinct screaming that this was too intimate, too much. But when Lila made a soft sound of distress, Evan turned back without thinking. She was sitting in the tub, her knees drawn up to her chest, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so weak. I can't even take care of myself." "You're not weak," Evan said fiercely, dropping to his knees beside the tub without a thought for his expensive clothes. "You're sick. There's a difference." Evan reached for a washcloth, his movements careful and reverent as he helped cool her fevered skin. This wasn't about the contract or the arrangement his parents had made. This was about the woman who had stumbled into his life and turned everything upside down. Every gentle stroke of the cloth was a confession he couldn't voice yet. Every tender touch a promise he was afraid to make. "Thank you," Lila breathed. Her eyes closed as Evan's ministrations began to ease her discomfort. "Always," Evan replied without thinking, the words slipping out like a vow. He changed cool cloths on her forehead every hour, his hands growing more confident with each tender touch. During the long nights, when Lila's fever made her restless and delirious, Evan would read to her from her favorite books, his voice steady and soothing, even when exhaustion made his eyes burn. On the second night, when Lila's fever spiked to 103, 5 degrees Fahrenheit, Evan thought he might lose his mind with worry. She was delirious, mumbling about her mother, about classes she needed to teach, about a contract she couldn't fulfill. Evan sat beside her in the dark, using a damp washcloth to cool her burning skin, whispering reassurances he hoped she could hear. "I'm here," he murmured, stroking the cloth along her temples, down her neck, across her shoulders with infinite gentleness. "You're safe. Just rest." When his fingers accidentally tangled in her hair, those beautiful curls damp with perspiration, Lila turned her face toward his touch with a soft sigh. Even in her fevered state, she seemed to find comfort in his presence. "Evan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm here," he repeated, setting aside the cloth to brush a curl away from her face. "What do you need? Don't leave," she pleaded, her hand searching blindly until it found his. "Please." Evan's breath caught as Lila's fingers intertwined with his. It was the first time she'd initiated contact, the first time he hadn't immediately pulled away. Her hand was small and warm in his, her grip surprisingly strong despite her illness. "I won't leave," Evan promised, settling more comfortably in his chair without breaking their connection. "I'll stay right here." Lila's breathing gradually evened out, her grip on his hand relaxing as she slipped into deeper sleep. But Evan didn't let go. He sat there through the night, watching her face in the dim light filtering through the curtains, marveling at how natural it felt to hold her hand, to be needed by someone who mattered more to him than his own comfort. By the third morning, Lila's fever had broken. Evan woke. He'd finally dozed off in the chair around Danto, find her watching him with clear, alert eyes. "You stayed," she said softly, her voice still weak but no longer fevered. "I promised I would," Evan replied, suddenly aware that they were still holding hands. He should let go. He should retreat to his usual safe distance. but Lila's thumb was tracing gentle circles across his knuckles, and the sensation was hypnotic. "Thank you," Lila whispered, "for taking care of me. I know this isn't what you signed up for." "Neither is this," Evan said quietly, lifting their joined hands to press a soft kiss to her knuckles. The gesture was tender, intimate, and completely spontaneous. Lila's eyes widened, her lips parting in surprise, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she shifted in the bed, making room beside her. "You must be exhausted," she said. "Lie down, please." Evan hesitated. Sharing a bed, even innocently, felt like crossing a massive line, but the invitation in Lila's eyes was too compelling to resist. Carefully, still holding her hand, he stretched out on top of the covers beside her. They lay facing each other, their joined hands resting between them on the pillow. In the soft morning light, Lila looked ethereal, her fever-flushed cheeks returning to their normal warm brown, her hair spread across the white pillowcase like dark silk. "I was scared," Lila admitted quietly, when the fever was really bad. "I kept thinking about my mother, about what would happen to her if something happened to me." "Nothing's going to happen to you," Evan said fiercely, surprising himself with his vehemence. "I won't let it." Lila smiled, the expression soft and wondering. "You're not what I expected, Evan Harper." "What did you expect?" Evan asked, genuinely curious. "Someone cold, calculating. Someone who saw this arrangement as purely transactional." Lila's thumb resumed its gentle stroking across his hand. "Instead, I found someone who plays beautiful music and reads poetry and stays up all night holding my hand when I'm sick." Evan felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I'm not good at this," he confessed, "at being close to people. You make me want to try, but I don't know how." "You're doing fine," Lila assured him, shifting slightly closer. "Better than fine." They talked quietly for another hour about books, about music, about Lila's childhood and Evan's lonely adolescence. The conversation was intimate in a way that had nothing to do with physical attraction and everything to do with genuine connection. Evan found himself sharing things he'd never told anyone, drawn out by Lila's patient warmth and the safety of their joined hands. When Lila finally fell back asleep, Evan remained beside her, watching the peaceful rise and fall of her breathing. 3 days ago, touching her hand would have sent him into a panic. Now, he couldn't imagine letting go. Something fundamental had shifted between them during her illness. The careful distance they'd maintained was crumbling, replaced by something deeper and more dangerous. Evan was falling in love with Lila Bennett, and for the first time in his life, his fear was losing the battle to his heart. As afternoon sun streamed through the windows, Evan closed his eyes and allowed himself to imagine a future where holding Lila's hand was just the beginning, where her gentle touch could heal more than just his fear of intimacy, where the woman hired to give him an heir might instead give him everything he'd never dared to hope for. Love. Chapter 5. Jealousy and Realization. Evan should have known something was wrong when Nathan Brooks knocked on his door unannounced on a Thursday evening. His business partner never visited the penthouse. Their meetings always took place in sterile conference rooms or over encrypted video calls. Nathan preferred his relationships clean, professional, and devoid of personal complications. But there he stood in Evan's foyer, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit that probably cost more than most people's cars, flashing the charming smile that had helped him close million-dollar deals and break countless hearts. "Surprise visit," Nathan announced, brushing past Evan with his usual confidence. "I was in the neighborhood finalizing the Patterson deal and thought I'd see how the hermit was surviving in the real world. You've been dodging my calls for 2 weeks." He stopped mid-sentence when Lila appeared in the kitchen doorway. Evan watched in slow-motion horror as Nathan's expression shifted from casual interest to predatory appreciation. Lila was wearing one of Evan's Harvard t-shirts over leggings, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, still slightly pale from her recent illness, but beautiful enough to stop traffic. She looked comfortable, domestic, like she belonged in Evan's space, which only made Nathan's hungry stare more infuriating. "Well, well," Nathan drawled, his voice taking on the smooth tone he used to seduce investors and women alike. "Evan, you didn't mention you had company." "Nathan, this is Lila," Evan said stiffly, moving protectively closer to her. "Lila, my business partner, Nathan Brooks." Lila stepped forward with a warm smile, extending her hand in greeting. "Nice to meet you, Nathan. Evan has told me so much about your work together." When Nathan took her hand, Evan felt something dark and primitive claw at his chest. Nathan didn't just shake Lila's hand. He held it, his thumb stroking across her knuckles in a gesture that made Evan's vision blur with rage. "The pleasure is entirely mine," Nathan said, his eyes traveling appreciatively over Lila's face, down to where Evan's oversized shirt hinted at her curves. "And what brings such a beautiful woman to our Evan's fortress of solitude?" Evan clenched his fists, fighting the urge to physically remove Nathan's hands from Lila. He'd never felt anything like this before, this burning, possessive fury that made him want to claim Lila in front of everyone, to mark her as his, in ways that terrified and thrilled him. "I'm staying here temporarily," Lila replied diplomatically, gently extracting her hand from Nathan's grip. "Evan has been incredibly kind." "I'm sure he has," Nathan said with a knowing smirk that made Evan want to hit something. "Though I have to say, Evan, keeping such lovely company is quite unlike you. Usually, you're allergic to anyone who doesn't communicate in binary code." The comment was meant to be playful, but Evan heard the underlying message loud and clear. What could someone like Lila possibly see in a socially awkward recluse like him? "Would you like some coffee?" Lila offered, apparently oblivious to the testosterone-charged atmosphere. "I was just making some." "I'd love some," Nathan said smoothly. "And I'd love to hear more about what you do. You seem far too interesting to be hanging around with this antisocial genius." As Lila moved toward the kitchen, Nathan followed, his gaze fixed on the sway of her hips beneath Evan's shirt. Evan trailed behind them, his hands shaking with suppressed rage as he watched Nathan deploy his considerable charm. For the next hour, Evan endured the torture of watching Nathan flirt with Lila. His business partner was everything. Evan wasn't socially confident, naturally charming, able to make conversation flow as easily as breathing. He told amusing stories about their business ventures, complimented Lila's intelligence, and gradually drew her into animated discussion about literature and art. Worst of all, Lila seemed to be enjoying herself. She laughed at Nathan's jokes, engaged with his questions about her studies, and appeared completely comfortable with his attention. Evan sat in his chair like a statue, watching the woman he was falling in love with be charmed by someone who could offer her everything he couldn't tease: confidence, a normal relationship free from the complications of their arrangement. "We should all have dinner sometime," Nathan suggested as the evening wound down. "I know a fantastic restaurant in Soho, very romantic atmosphere." The way he looked at Lila when he said romantic made Evan's blood boil. "That sounds lovely," Lila began, but Evan cut her off. "Actually, we're quite busy," Evan said, his voice colder than he'd intended. "Lila has her studies, and I have several projects demanding my attention." Nathan raised an eyebrow at Evan's tone, but his smile never wavered. "Of course, but surely even workaholics need to eat. Lila, perhaps you'd like to see some of the city while you're here. I'd be happy to show you around." The invitation was clearly meant for Lila alone, and the possessive fury that had been building in Evan's chest finally exploded. "She doesn't need a tour guide," Evan snapped, standing abruptly. "And I'm sure you have more important things to do than play tourist with my house guest." The silence that followed was deafening. Nathan looked genuinely surprised by Evan's vehemence, while Lila stared at him with wide eyes, clearly taken aback by his jealous outburst. "Right," Nathan said slowly, his sharp mind already processing the implications of Evan's possessiveness. "Well, it's getting late anyway. Lila, it was truly delightful meeting you. Evan, we'll talk soon." After Nathan left, the penthouse felt charged with unspoken tension. Lila stood in the kitchen, her arms crossed, studying Evan with an expression he couldn't read. "That was rude," she said finally. "He was flirting with you," Evan replied, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't control. "So?" Lila's eyebrows rose in challenge. "He was being friendly." "There's a difference." "There's no difference with Nathan," Evan said bitterly. "He collects beautiful women like some people collect art. You'd just be another conquest." "And what would I be to you, Evan?" Lila asked quietly, her question cutting straight to the heart of everything they'd been avoiding. Evan stared at her, his mouth opening and closing without sound. What was she to him? More than a contractual obligation, more than a house guest, more than anything he'd ever imagined wanting. But how could he explain that when he could barely understand it himself? "I don't know," he whispered finally, the honesty ripping from his throat like a confession. Lila's expression softened. "Then maybe you should figure it out." She turned to leave, but Evan called her name, desperation making him bold. "Don't go out with him," Evan said, his voice breaking. "Please." Lila paused in the doorway. "Why not?" "Because," Evan struggled for words that could express the chaos in his heart. "Because I can't stand the thought of him touching you. Because watching him look at you made me want to do violent things I've never even imagined. Because the idea of you laughing with him, smiling at him, letting him charm you, makes me feel like I'm drowning." The words hung in the air between them, raw and honest and terrifying. Lila turned slowly to face him, her eyes wide with something that might have been wonder. "Evan," she breathed, and his name on her lips sounded like a prayer. "I know I have no right to ask," Evan continued, his voice gaining strength. "I know our arrangement doesn't give me any claim on you, but I'm asking anyway because the thought of losing you to someone like Nathan is killing me." Lila crossed the room in 3 quick strides, her hands coming up to frame his face. Evan felt his breath catch at the touch, at the warmth in her eyes as she looked at him. "You're not losing me to anyone," she said softly. "And you have more right to ask than you know." "Lila," Evan whispered, his hands coming up to cover hers. "I wanted to make you jealous," she admitted, her cheeks flushing. "When Nathan was flirting, part of me hoped it would push you to finally tell me how you feel." "How I feel," Evan echoed, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Like maybe this stopped being about a contract weeks ago," Lila said, rising on her tiptoes until their faces were inches apart. "Like maybe we're both falling for something real." Evan's control shattered. All the fear, all the careful distance he'd maintained, all the walls he'd built around his heart crumbled in the face of Lila's honest confession. Without thinking, without planning, without giving his terror time to intervene, Evan cupped her face in his hands and kissed her. The kiss was everything Evan had imagined and nothing like he'd expected. Lila's lips were soft and warm beneath his, yielding and perfect as she melted against him. When she sighed into his mouth, opening for him, Evan felt like he was flying and falling simultaneously. Months of suppressed desire poured into that kiss, every moment of wanting, every night of dreaming, every careful touch that had led them to this point. Evan's hands tangled in Lila's hair, and she pressed closer, her arms winding around his neck as if she never wanted to let him go. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Evan pressed his forehead against hers. "I'm falling in love with you," he whispered, the words slipping out before he could stop them. "I think I've been falling since the moment you walked into my life." Lila's smile was radiant. "Good," she said, pulling him down for another kiss, "because I'm already gone." Chapter 6. Learning to Love. The morning after their first kiss, Evan woke with his heart racing and his mind spinning with possibilities. For the first time in his adult life, he told someone he loved them, and she'd said it back. The memory of Lila's lips beneath his, the way she'd melted into his arms, the breathless confession they'd shared played on repeat in his mind like his favorite song. But with the dawn came uncertainty. What did people do after they confessed their love? How was he supposed to act around Lila now that everything had changed? Evan found his answer when he entered the kitchen and saw Lila making coffee in one of his button-down shirts, her legs bare beneath the hem. She looked up when he appeared, and the radiant smile that spread across her face chased away all his doubts. "Good morning," she said softly, approaching him with none of the careful distance they'd maintained before. "Sleep well?" Instead of answering, Evan cupped her face in his hands and kissed her good morning, soft, sweet, and reverent. When they parted, Lila's eyes were bright with happiness. "Much better now," Evan murmured against her lips, marveling at how natural this felt, how right. "I have an idea," Lila said, her arms winding around his waist. "What if we had a proper date, something normal couples do?" The word couples sent a thrill through Evan's chest. "What did you have in mind?" "There's an art exhibition opening at the Met today," Lila said, her enthusiasm infectious. "Contemporary artists reimagining classical themes. It sounds perfect for someone who appreciates both innovation and tradition." Evan hesitated. The Metropolitan Museum meant crowds. Strangers the kind of social situations that usually sent him into panic attacks. But the hope in Lila's eyes made him want to be brave. "I'd like that," he said, surprised by his own conviction. "But first, let me make this official." That afternoon, Evan did something he'd never done in his adult life. He called a car service instead of hiding behind a computer screen. As they rode through Manhattan traffic, Lila's hand warm in his, Evan marveled at how different the city looked when you weren't afraid of it. The museum was crowded, just as Evan had feared, but something magical happened when they walked through the galleries together. With Lila beside him, her arm linked through his, the chaos became background noise. Her excitement was infectious as she led him from painting to painting, discussing technique and symbolism with the expertise of someone who genuinely loved art. "Look at this one," Lila said, stopping before a massive canvas that reimagined Botticelli's Venus as a modern black woman rising from urban waters. The way she's merged classical beauty standards with contemporary social commentary is brilliant. Evan found himself studying the painting, not just for its artistic merit, but for the way Lila's eyes lit up when she explained the symbolism. When she pointed out details in the brushwork, he moved closer, his chest pressed against her back, his chin resting on her shoulder. "You see that gold thread woven through her hair?" Lila asked, leaning back against him. Evan hummed, but he was more interested in the way Lila smelled something floral and warm that made him want to bury his face in her neck. When his breath brushed against her ear, he felt her shiver. "Evan," she whispered, his name a gentle warning. "Sorry," he murmured, but he didn't step away. Instead, his hands found her waist, holding her against him as they moved through the gallery like dancers following unheard music. By the time they'd seen the entire exhibition, Evan was drunk on Lila's proximity, the way she'd lean into him when she got excited about a piece, how she'd unconsciously place her hand on his chest when making a point, the soft gasps she'd make when he'd whisper observations in her ear. Every moment was building tension that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with desire. "That was incredible," Lila said as they stepped outside into the golden light of late afternoon. "Thank you for coming with me." "Thank you for showing me," Evan replied. "I've been to museums before, but I've never seen them through your eyes." They decided to walk back toward his building, taking their time through Central Park as the sun set behind the trees. Other couples strolled the paths around them, and for the first time in his life, Evan felt like he belonged among them. "Tell me something," Lila said as they found a bench overlooking the lake. "What's your favorite part of building software?" Evan considered the question, surprised by how personal it felt. "The moment when all the pieces finally work together," he said. "When you've been struggling with a problem for days, and suddenly the solution appears, and it's more elegant than anything you could have planned." "Like magic," Lila said, understanding immediately. "Exactly like magic," Evan agreed. "What about you? What's your favorite part of literature?" "The way words can make you feel less alone," Lila said without hesitation. "When you read something that captures exactly what you've been feeling but couldn't express, and you realize someone else has been there too." Evan turned to study her profile in the fading light. "Is that why you want to teach?" "Partly," Lila nodded. "I want to help students discover that connection, that sense of recognition that makes you feel seen." "You make me feel seen," Evan said quietly, the confession slipping out before he could stop it. Lila turned to face him fully, her expression soft with emotion. "You make me feel brave," she replied, "like I can be completely myself without apology." The honesty of the moment hung between them, beautiful and fragile. Evan reached up to stroke her cheek, his thumb tracing the curve of her smile. "I want to take you somewhere special," he said suddenly. "Where?" Evan stood, extending his hand. "Trust me." 20 minutes later, they were standing on the rooftop of his building. The city spread out below them like a constellation of dreams. Evan had arranged for dinner to be set up, their candles, flowers, her favorite wine, all orchestrated with the efficiency that made him successful in business, but applied now to romance. "Evan," Lila breathed, her eyes wide with wonder. "This is beautiful." "Not as beautiful as you," Evan said, the words feeling natural instead of terrifying. They ate dinner as the stars appeared overhead, talking about everything and nothing, their conversation flowing like music. When a slow song drifted up from a wedding reception in the building next door, Evan stood and extended his hand. "Dance with me," he said. "Here?" Lila asked, but she was already rising to meet him. "Here," Evan confirmed, pulling her into his arms. They swayed together in the candlelight, Lila's head resting on Evan's shoulder, their bodies fitting together like pieces of the same puzzle. Evan had never danced with anyone before, but with Lila in his arms, he felt like he could do anything. "This is perfect," Lila murmured against his neck. Evan spun her gently, then pulled her back against his chest, both of them laughing at his clumsy technique. When the song ended, they stayed wrapped in each other's arms, neither wanting the moment to end. "Lila," Evan said softly, his hands framing her face in the starlight. "Yes? I'm going to kiss you now," he whispered. "And I'm not going to stop because I'm scared." "Good," Lila breathed, rising on her tiptoes to meet him halfway. This kiss was different from their first, deeper, more confident, full of promise. Evan poured all his newfound courage into it, showing Lila with his lips and hands how much she meant to him. When she sighed into his mouth, he felt like he could conquer the world. "I love you," Evan whispered against her lips. "I love you too," Lila replied, her words making his heart soar. As they held each other under the stars, Evan realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of tomorrow. With Lila in his arms, the future looked bright with possibilities he'd never dared to imagine. He was learning to love, and it was the most beautiful education of his life. Chapter 7. Making Love. Evan spent the entire day planning for perfection, but by evening his hands were shaking so badly he could barely light the candles. It had been 3 weeks since their first kiss, 3 weeks of growing closer in every way, except the one that terrified him most. They'd shared countless kisses, tender touches, whispered confessions in the dark, but they hadn't crossed the final line, the one that would make their connection complete. Tonight felt different. Tonight, Evan was determined to show Lila how completely he loved her, even if his inexperience made him uncertain. The penthouse terrace had been transformed into something from a fairy tale. Hundreds of white candles flickered in glass hurricanes, creating pools of golden light against the Manhattan skyline. Rose petals scattered across the dining table caught the flames like captured starlight, and the soft melody of a string quartet drifted up from the courtyard below. Evan checked his watch for the 10th time in 5 minutes. Lila was getting ready in her room, giving him time to prepare their dinner, though prepare was a generous term for what amounted to arranging takeout from the city's most exclusive restaurant onto proper china. "Evan." Lila's voice came from behind him, soft and wondering. He turned, and his breath caught in his throat. Lila stood in the doorway, wearing a flowing dress in deep midnight blue that seemed to capture starlight in its folds. The fabric hugged her curves before falling in elegant waves to her ankles, and her hair was swept up in a style that left her neck gracefully exposed. But it was her eyes that stopped his heart warm and bright with love, with trust, with the same nervous anticipation that was making his pulse race. "You're beautiful," Evan whispered, the words inadequate but heartfelt. "So are you," Lila replied, her gaze taking in the candlelit terrace, the rose petals, the obvious care he'd put into every detail. "Evan, this is incredible." She moved toward him like a goddess walking through a dream, and when she reached him, Evan took her hands in his, marveling at how natural the gesture had become. "I wanted tonight to be special," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I wanted you to know how much you mean to me." "I already know," Lila assured him, rising on her tiptoes to brush a soft kiss across his lips. "But show me anyway." Dinner was a blur of soft conversation and heated glances. Evan found himself unable to concentrate on the exquisite food, too distracted by the way candlelight played across Lila's skin, the way her lips curved when she smiled, the way her eyes seemed to hold promises that made his blood burn. "You're staring," Lila said softly when they'd finished eating. "I can't help it." Evan admitted, "I keep thinking I'm dreaming. At any moment, I'll wake up, and you'll be gone." Lila stood and moved around the table to him, her hands coming to rest on his shoulders. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice gentle but certain. "I'm exactly where I want to be." Evan rose to meet her, his arms circling her waist as if he could anchor her to him through touch alone. When he kissed her, It was with all the passion he'd been holding back, all the love he'd been afraid to show. Lila melted against him, her soft moan making him dizzy with want. "Lila," he breathed against her lips, his hands tangling in her hair. "I know," she whispered back, understanding without words what he was asking, what he needed. "I want this too. I want you." Evan's control snapped. He lifted Lila easily, carrying her inside to his bedroom as she laughed softly against his neck. He'd imagined this moment countless times, but nothing had prepared him for the reality of having her in his arms, willing and wanting and trusting him with her heart. In his bedroom, Evan set Lila down gently beside his bed, his hands trembling as they framed her face. "I've never," he began, then stopped, embarrassment flooding his cheeks. "I know," Lila said softly, her hands covering his. "We'll go slow. We'll figure it out together." The simple acceptance in her voice undid him. Evan kissed her with desperate gratitude, pouring all his love and fear and desire into the contact. When Lila's hands moved to the buttons of his shirt, he held his breath, letting her undress him with gentle reverence. "You're beautiful," Lila whispered, her hands exploring the planes of his chest, the lean strength of his arms. Evan had always thought of his body as simply functional, but under Lila's admiring gaze, he felt transformed. When it was his turn to undress her, Evan's fingers shook as he slowly lowered the zipper of her dress. The fabric whispered to the floor, revealing skin that glowed like warm honey in the candlelight. Lila was perfect curves and softness and feminine strength that made Evan's mouth go dry with wanting. "Touch me," Lila said softly, guiding his hands to her waist, her shoulders, showing him how to worship her body with gentle strokes. Evan learned quickly, his touch growing more confident as Lila's soft gasps and sighs told him what she liked. When he kissed her neck, she arched against him. When his hands traced the curve of her spine, she trembled. When he whispered her name like a prayer, she pulled him closer. They moved to the bed together, skin against skin, hearts beating in synchrony. Evan had read about intimacy, had seen movies, had imagined what this might be like, but nothing had prepared him for the overwhelming reality of Lila beneath him, around him, welcoming him into her body and her heart. "Are you okay?" Lila asked when Evan hesitated, his body trembling with the effort of control. "More than okay," Evan breathed, his voice thick with emotion. "I love you so much it terrifies me." "Don't be terrified," Lila said, her hands stroking his face, his shoulders, grounding him in the moment. "This is beautiful. We're beautiful." When they finally joined together, Evan thought he might die from the intensity of it. Lila was warm and perfect around him, her body accepting his with a sweetness that brought tears to his eyes. They moved together, slowly at first, learning each other's rhythms, discovering what made each other gasp and sigh and cry out with pleasure. "Like this?" Evan asked, his voice strained as he tried to give her everything she needed. "Perfect," Lila breathed, her legs wrapping around his waist, pulling him deeper. "You're perfect." The praise undid him. Evan buried his face in Lila's neck, breathing in her scent as their bodies found their rhythm. Every stroke, every touch, every whispered endearment was a revelation. This was what he'd been missing, what he'd been afraid of, what he thought he could never have. Love, connection, the miraculous joining of two hearts and bodies that created something greater than either could achieve alone. When Lila's breathing grew ragged, when her fingers dug into his shoulders and she called his name like a prayer, Evan felt his own control shatter. They climbed together toward something beautiful and overwhelming, their bodies and hearts perfectly synchronized. "Evan," Lila gasped, her back arching as pleasure overwhelmed her. "I love you. I love you," Evan replied, and then he was falling, flying, drowning in sensation and emotion as he followed her over the edge. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the candlelight, their breathing slowly returning to normal. Evan held Lila against his chest, his hand stroking her hair, still amazed that this beautiful, incredible woman had chosen him. "That was..." Evan began, then stopped, overwhelmed by the inadequacy of words. "Perfect," Lila finished, lifting her head to smile at him. "You were perfect." "I was terrified," Evan admitted, his honesty making Lila's expression soften. "I know," she said, pressing a gentle kiss to his chest. "But you were brave." You trusted me. And you let me love you. How could I not? Evan asked, his arms tightening around her. You make me want to be brave. You make me want to be everything I never thought I could be. They talked softly as the candles burned lower, their voices mixing with the distant sounds of the city. Evan traced patterns on Lila's skin, marveling at the way she shivered under his touch, at how natural it felt to hold her, to love her, to be loved in return. What are you thinking? Lila asked, noticing his contemplative expression. That I spent 28 years thinking I was broken, Evan said quietly. That I could never have this, never deserve this. And then you walked into my life and showed me that love isn't about being perfect. It's about being real. You were never broken, Lila said fiercely, her hands cupping his face. You were just waiting for the right person to show you how incredible you are. Evan kissed her then, soft and sweet and full of promise. As they settled into sleep, their bodies entwined, Evan realized that for the first time in his life, he wasn't afraid of tomorrow. With Lila in his arms, the future looked bright with possibilities he'd never dared to imagine. He'd found love, and it had transformed him completely. Chapter 8. Complications. Evan woke to the sensation of Lila's lips pressed against his neck, her warm breath sending shivers down his spine as she traced lazy patterns across his chest. 3 days had passed since they'd first made love, and Evan was discovering that physical intimacy was intoxicating. Every touch, every kiss, every soft sigh Lila made when he held her close made him crave more. Good morning, Lila murmured against his skin, her voice husky with sleep and desire. Very good morning, Evan replied, his hands finding the curve of her waist beneath the sheets. They'd barely left his bedroom in the past 72 hours, surviving on room service and each other, lost in a haze of discovery and passion. Lila lifted her head to look at him, her hair falling in soft waves around her face, her lips swollen from his kisses. Evan reached up to brush a curl away from her cheek, marveling at how natural this felt, waking up with the woman he loved. No barriers between them, nothing but honesty and desire. I was thinking, Lila said, pressing a kiss to his palm, maybe we could actually leave this room today, see some sunlight, remember what the outside world looks like. Why would we want to do that? Evan asked, pulling her closer until she was sprawled across his chest. I like our world just fine. Lila laughed, the sound making Evan's heart flutter. Because I need a shower that doesn't involve you distracting me every 5 minutes. I don't distract you, Evan protested, his hands sliding down to grip her hips. I enhance your bathing experience. Is that what you call it? Lila's eyebrows rose in amusement, but her voice caught when Evan's thumbs traced circles on her skin. Evan, I'm serious. We should. She was interrupted by Evan's mouth, finding that sensitive spot on her neck, the one that made her arch against him, and forget whatever practical thing she'd been about to say. What were you saying? Evan murmured against her skin, his lips trailing down to her collarbone. I was saying, oh God. Lila's protest dissolved into a soft moan as his hands roamed her body with growing confidence. We can't spend forever in bed. Watch me, Evan said, rolling them over so Lila was beneath him, her hair spread across the pillow like dark silk. I have years of lost time to make up for. Their morning lovemaking was slow and tender, a celebration of the intimacy they discovered together. Evan worshipped every inch of Lila's body as if it were the first time, his touch reverent and passionate. When they finally made it to the shower an hour later, Evan kept his promise to enhance the experience, his soapy hands exploring every curve until Lila was gasping his name against the marble wall. The sound of the private elevator chiming cut through their post-shower bliss like a knife. Both of them froze, their eyes wide with sudden panic. Are you expecting someone? Lila whispered, clutching a towel around herself. Evan shook his head, his mind racing. Nobody had access to his penthouse except his parents, and they weren't supposed to be back from Europe for another 3 months. Unless… Evan, his mother's cultured voice echoed through the penthouse, followed by the sharp click of expensive heels on marble. We're home early. Where are you, darling? Evan breathed, panic coursing through his veins. His parents couldn't find Lila in his bedknot like this. Not when they were both naked and thoroughly disheveled from hours of lovemaking. Get dressed, he whispered urgently to Lila, who was already scrambling for her clothes. "I'll go distract them." Evan pulled on jeans and a t-shirt with shaking hands, running his fingers through his hair in a futile attempt to look like he hadn't spent the morning worshipping every inch of Lila's body. He stepped into the hallway just as his parents rounded the corner, their expressions shifting from pleasant surprise to careful assessment. Eleanor Harper was exactly what central casting would order for the role of wealthy matriarch, silver hair pulled into a perfect chignon, designer clothes that cost more than most people's cars, and the kind of poise that came from generations of inherited privilege. His father, Charles, stood beside her in an impeccably tailored suit, his shrewd businessman's eyes already cataloging details. "Mother, father," Evan said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You're back early." "The Brussels conference ended sooner than expected," Charles replied, his gaze sharp as it took in Evan's appearance. "We weren't supposed to return for another 3 months. But we heard some interesting reports about your situation." Evan's heart hammered against his ribs. Had they been monitoring him? Of course they had. "I've been working on a new project," Evan said, which wasn't technically a lie. Learning to love Lila was definitely a project, just not the kind his parents would appreciate. "How wonderful," Eleanor smiled, but there was something calculating in her expression. "And how is our arrangement progressing?" "I trust Miss Bennett is proving satisfactory." The clinical way she referred to Lila made Evan's stomach turn. "She's fine. Everything is fine." "Excellent," Charles said, clapping Evan on the shoulder with false bonhomie. "We were hoping to meet with her this morning, actually, discuss the terms of the contract. Make sure everyone's expectations are aligned." Evan's blood ran cold. "That's not necessary. We're handling everything ourselves." "Nonsense." Eleanor waved away his objection. "This is far too important to leave to chance." "Where is she?" Before Evan could answer, Lila appeared in the hallway, fully dressed but with her hair still slightly mussed and her lips bearing the telltale signs of Evan's kisses. She moved toward them with her usual grace, but Evan could see the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she held herself. "Mr. and Mrs. Harper," Lila said politely, extending her hand. "I'm Lila Bennett. It's lovely to meet you." Eleanor's smile was arctic as she shook Lila's hand. "Indeed. How has your stay been, my dear?" "Wonderful," Lila replied, her voice steady despite the obvious awkwardness. "Evan has been very kind." "I'm sure he has," Charles said, his tone suggesting hidden meanings that made Evan want to step protectively in front of Lila. "Perhaps we could all sit down and discuss the arrangement," Eleanor suggested, her words cutting through the air like a knife. "I'm sure you both understand that this is ultimately a business transaction. It's important to maintain proper boundaries." Evan felt his world tilt sideways. Business transaction? Proper boundaries? As if the past month hadn't happened. As if the love he'd found with Lila was nothing more than a contract to be managed. "The original terms were quite specific," Charles added, pulling out a leather portfolio. 6 months, with clear expectations about emotional involvement. We're concerned that those boundaries may have become blurred." "I think we're doing just fine without interference," Evan said, his voice harder than he'd intended. "Interference?" Charles's eyebrows rose. "Son, we're trying to protect you. Women like Miss Bennett are very good at making men believe in fantasies that don't exist." "What's that supposed to mean?" Evan demanded, his hands clenching into fists. "It means," Eleanor said with cruel precision, "that some people are very skilled at confusing gratitude with affection, physical attraction with emotional connection. You're paying Miss Bennett a considerable sum of money, Evan. It would be naive to assume her feelings are entirely genuine." Lila had gone very still beside him, her face carefully blank in the way that meant she was hiding deep hurt. Evan saw her hands trembling slightly. Saw the way she seemed to shrink into herself with each cutting word. Furthermore, Charles continued relentlessly. "We've spoken with several relationship experts who confirm that men with your particular background are especially vulnerable to manipulation by experienced women." "Experienced?" Evan's voice was dangerous now. "What exactly are you implying about Lila?" "We're not implying anything," Eleanor said smoothly. "We're simply stating facts." "Miss Bennett answered a very specific advertisement. She needed money desperately. She moved into your home and quite conveniently managed to seduce a man who had never been intimate with anyone before. The progression seems rather calculated." The words hit Evan like physical blows. He turned to look at Lila, who had gone even paler, her eyes bright with unshed tears. For a terrible moment, he saw her through his parents' eyes, a woman who needed money desperately enough to answer their advertisement, a woman who'd had every reason to make him fall in love with her to secure her position and increase her payout. "That's not true," Evan said. But his voice cracked on the words, and he hated the doubt that was already creeping into his mind like poison. "Isn't it?" Eleanor asked gently, as if she were speaking to a child. "You've always been isolated, darling. You have no experience with women, no way to judge whether someone's feelings are real or merely professional." "Stop," Lila said quietly, her voice steady but her hands trembling. "Please, don't do this. We're not doing anything except looking out for our son's best interests," Charles replied. This arrangement was supposed to be simple contractual obligation, nothing more. "Nothing more," Evan repeated numbly, the words echoing in his head like a curse. He looked at Lila Rayleigh, looked at Heron for a terrible moment. He saw her through his parents' eyes. A woman who needed money desperately enough to answer their advertisement, a woman who'd had every reason to make him fall in love with her, to secure her position and increase her payout. "Evan," Lila said softly, reaching for his hand, but he pulled away before she could touch him. The hurt that flashed across her face was so profound that Evan immediately regretted the gesture, but the damage was done. His parents had planted the seed of doubt, and now it was growing like poison in his chest. "Perhaps Miss Bennett would like some time to consider whether she wants to continue with the original arrangement," Eleanor suggested with false kindness, "or if she'd prefer to pursue other opportunities." Lila stood abruptly, her dignity intact even as her world crumbled around her. "I should go," she said quietly. "This was a mistake." "Lila, wait," Evan called as she turned to leave, but she was already walking away, her spine straight and her head held high. Evan started to follow her, but his father's hand on his arm stopped him. "Let her go, son," Charles said gently. "If her feelings were real, she would have stayed to fight for you. The fact that she's running proves our point." For the next hour, Evan paced his penthouse like a caged animal, while his parents systematically dismantled everything he thought he knew about his relationship with Lila. They presented bank records, showing her family's desperate financial situation, psychological profiles about how isolation made him vulnerable to manipulation, even testimonials from other wealthy men who'd been taken advantage of by women in desperate circumstances. But as Evan listened to their clinical dissection of his love affair, he realized they were wrong about one crucial thing. Lila wasn't running because her feelings weren't real. She was running because they were, and the thought of staying to defend a love that had just been called into question was too painful to bear. By the time Evan understood that, by the time he pushed past his parents' protests and reached the guest room, Lila was gone. Her clothes, her books, every trace of her presence had vanished, as if she'd never been there at all except for the lingering scent of her perfume and the hollow ache in Evan's chest where his heart used to be. He'd found love, and in the space of an hour, he'd lost it again, not to circumstance or fate, but to the poisonous doubt his parents had injected into his veins. Standing in the empty room that had been Lila's sanctuary, Evan realized he'd made the biggest mistake of his life, and he had no idea how to fix it. The woman he loved was gone, and this time it was entirely his fault. Chapter 9. The Choice. For 3 weeks, Evan lived in hell. He threw himself into work with manic intensity, coding 18-hour days until his eyes burned and his hands cramped. He took meetings with investors, launched new projects, made millions of dollars that meant absolutely nothing without Lila there to share his victories. His penthouse felt like a mausoleum, every room echoing with memories of her laughter, her touch, her presence that had transformed his sterile world into something warm and alive. His parents were pleased with his return to focus, praising his dedication to business while carefully avoiding any mention of Lila's name. But Evan saw through their satisfaction to the calculation beneath. They believed they'd won, that they had successfully separated him from what they viewed as a dangerous distraction. They had no idea that every moment without Lila was killing him slowly from the inside. Evan had tried to find her, hiring the best private investigators money could buy, but Lila had vanished completely. She'd closed her bank accounts, abandoned her apartment, and dropped out of university. She was living entirely on cash, staying in places that didn't require credit checks or background verification. She didn't want to be found, and Evan couldn't blame her. He'd failed her when she needed him most, let his parents' poison infect the most beautiful thing that had ever happened to him. But 3 weeks of agony had crystallized one absolute truth. He loved Lila Bennett more than he feared his parents' disapproval, more than he needed their money or approval, more than he valued his own safety and comfort. He was going to find her, and he was going to spend the rest of his life making up for the moment he doubted her love. "We need to talk," Evan announced, striding into his father's study where both parents were reviewing quarterly reports over breakfast. Charles Harper looked up with mild surprise. "Of course, son. What's on your mind?" "I'm calling off the arrangement," Evan said without preamble. "All of it, the contract, the expectations, everything." Eleanor's coffee cup rattled against its saucer. "Evan, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about choosing love over obligation," Evan replied, his voice steady with conviction. "I'm in love with Lila Bennett, and I'm going to marry her not because of some contract you arranged, but because she's the best thing that's ever happened to me." The silence that followed was deafening. Evan's parents exchanged a look that was part shock, part disappointment, and part calculation. "Son," Charles said carefully, "you're being emotional." "Miss." Bennett played her role very well, but she didn't play anything. Evan cut him off. "She loved, merely loved me, and I was too much of a coward to defend that love when you attacked it." "This is exactly what we were afraid of," Eleanor said, rising from her chair with regal indignation. "You've confused a business transaction with a romance novel." "No," Evan said firmly. "You've confused manipulation with protection. You've spent my entire life trying to control every aspect of my existence, and I'm done." Evan moved to his father's safe, inputting the combination he'd memorized years ago during a moment of teenage rebellion. Inside, beneath documents and jewelry, was the original contract his parents had commissioned. "This is what I think of your arrangement," Evan said, tearing the contract into pieces that scattered across the Persian rug like snow. "You can't be serious," Charles said, his businessman's composure finally cracking. "You're worth $500 million. You could have any woman in the world. Why are you throwing your life away for someone who—" "Someone who what?" Evan demanded. "Someone who made me laugh for the first time in years? Someone who taught me that vulnerability is strength, not weakness? Someone who saw past my money and my anxiety to the man underneath? Someone who disappeared the moment things got complicated?" Eleanor pointed out cruelly. The words hit their mark, and Evan felt doubt flicker through his chest before he pushed it away. "She left because I made her feel like her love wasn't wanted, like it wasn't real. That's on me, not her." Evan headed for the door, but his father's voice stopped him cold. "There's something you should know," Charles said quietly, "about the contract, about why we really brought Miss Bennett here." Evan turned slowly, dread pooling in his stomach at his father's tone. "The arrangement was never meant to be permanent," Charles continued. "We've been working with our legal team to ensure that any entanglements could be cleanly severed when necessary." "What does that mean?" Evan asked. Though he wasn't sure he wanted to know, Eleanor pulled a manila folder from her briefcase, her expression carefully neutral. "It means we've already filed paperwork to have the contract declared null and void. We're prepared to argue that you were mentally compromised when you formed an emotional attachment to Miss Bennett." "Mentally compromised?" Evan's voice was dangerously quiet. "Your social anxiety, your isolation, your inexperience with women," Charles explained, as if he were discussing the weather. "All documented by years of therapy records. Any competent lawyer could argue that you were taken advantage of by someone who knew exactly how to exploit your vulnerabilities." The betrayal hit Evan like a physical blow. "You're trying to destroy her." "We're trying to protect you," Eleanor insisted, "and our family's legacy." "Do you have any idea what the media would do with this story? The headlines alone. I don't give a damn about headlines," Evan said, his voice shaking with rage. "And I won't let you destroy the woman I love to protect your precious reputation." "It's too late," Charles said with cold finality. "The paperwork is already filed. Miss Bennett has been served with notice that any claims against our family or attempts to contact you will result in legal action. Evan felt the room spin around him. You had her served? She's been neutralized as a threat, Eleanor said matter-of-factly. She can't come after you for money or emotional damages. She can't publish her story or embarrass our family. She's been made to understand that any future contact will have serious consequences. You monsters, Evan breathed, backing toward the door. You absolute monsters. He ran from the room, from the house, from the suffocating weight of his family's expectations. In his car, speeding through Manhattan traffic with no destination in mind, Evan's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. She's in Millbrook. Miller's Diner on Route 44. She's been working there since she left. She's been asking for you. A friend. Evan's hands shook as he read the message. Someone, maybe one of the investigators he'd hired, had found her. Lila was less than 2 hours away, and if his parents were right about the legal papers, she probably thought he'd orchestrated the whole thing. By the time Evan reached the small town of Millbrook, evening shadows were lengthening across the rural landscape. Miller's Diner was exactly what he'd expect. A classic small-town establishment with checkered floors and neon signs advertising pie. Through the window, he could see her. Lila was wearing a simple uniform, her hair pulled back in a ponytail, moving between tables with the same grace that had first captivated him. But even from a distance, Evan could see the changes. She looked thinner, tired, and there was a careful distance in her interactions with customers that spoke of someone guarding herself against further hurt. When the diner's bell chimed his entrance, every conversation stopped. Small towns notice strangers, especially ones arriving in expensive cars wearing designer clothes. But Evan only had eyes for Lila, who had frozen by a corner booth, her face cycling through shock, joy, and fear in rapid succession. Lila, he said, her name a prayer on his lips. She set down the coffee pot she'd been holding with shaking hands. You shouldn't be here. I know about the legal papers, Evan said, moving toward her despite the curious stares of other customers. I know what my parents did. I had nothing to do with it. Evan, please. Lila's voice was barely a whisper. I can't. This is exactly what they said would happen if I tried to contact you. I don't care what they said, Evan replied, close enough now to see the tears gathering in her eyes. I'm here because I love you. Because I've spent 3 weeks in hell realizing that choosing my parents over you was the biggest mistake of my life. Lila looked around the diner, aware of the audience they'd gained. Not here, please. Evan followed her outside into the parking lot, where autumn air carried the scent of burning leaves and approaching winter. Under the pale light of a street lamp, Lila looked fragile and beautiful and heartbreakingly sad. I tried to call you, she said quietly. After I left, I wanted to explain, to fight for us, but your parents' lawyers made it very clear that any contact would result in legal action against me and my mother. My mother, Evan said, suddenly realizing what he'd missed. How is she? The treatments? She's fine, Lila said quickly. The hospital has a charity program that covered most of the costs. She doesn't need your money. The way she said your money like it was something dirty made Evan's chest ache. Lila, I never wanted you for an heir. I wanted you because you made me feel alive. I know, she whispered. But wanting isn't enough, is it? Your parents will never accept me. They'll always see me as the woman who answered their advertisement. Then we'll build a life without them, Evan said desperately. We'll go somewhere they can't touch us. Lila's smile was heartbreaking. Evan, there's something you need to know. Something that changes everything. She took a shaky breath, her hands moving to rest on her stomach in a gesture that made Evan's heart stop. I'm pregnant. The words hung in the cold air between them like a miracle and a curse simultaneously. Evan stared at her, his mind reeling with the implications. Pregnant? He repeated numbly. 8 weeks, Lila confirmed, tears streaming down her cheeks. I found out 2 days ago. I've been trying to figure out what to do, how to tell you, whether I even should tell you. Evan reached for her, but Lila stepped back, shaking her head. Your parents were right about one thing, she said. This is too complicated, too messy. You have your whole life ahead of you, and I won't trap you with a baby you never asked for. Trap me? Evan's voice cracked. Lila, You're carrying my child. How could that be anything but a miracle? Because it makes everything your parents said look true, Lila replied. The gold digger who got pregnant to secure her future. The woman who manipulated a lonely man into love. That's not what happened, and you know it. Do I? Lila asked, her voice breaking. Because right now, I can't tell the difference between love and obligation, between what was real and what was just the contract we were both trying to fulfill. She turned to walk away, but Evan called after her, his voice breaking with desperation. Don't run again, he pleaded. Please, we can figure this out together. Lila paused without turning around. I need time to think about the baby, about us, about what's best for everyone. How much time? Evan asked. I don't know, she whispered. And then she was gone, disappearing into the diner and leaving Evan standing alone in the parking lot with his heart in pieces. As he drove back to Manhattan, Evan realized that finding Lila had been the easy part, convincing her to trust their love again, to believe in a future together despite his parents' interference, would be the fight of his life. But he was ready for that fight. Because the woman he loved was carrying his child, and he'd be damned if he'd let fear or doubt or family pressure destroy their chance at happiness. This time, he wouldn't let her run. This time, he'd prove that their love was worth fighting for. Chapter 10. Life and Love. 3 months, 91 days of private investigators, dead-end leads, and sleepless nights that stretched into gray dawns. Evan had searched every hospital, every clinic, every women's shelter within a 500-mile radius of Millbrook. Lila had vanished again, this time taking his unborn child with her, and the uncertainty was eating him alive from the inside out. He'd lost 40 pounds, his business was hemorrhaging money as he focused entirely on the search, and his parents had finally stopped their legal maneuvering, partly because Evan had transferred his assets into an untouchable trust, and partly because even they seemed disturbed by their son's obsessive quest. She doesn't want to be found, his mother had said during their last conversation. Perhaps it's time to accept that and move on. But Evan couldn't move on, not when Lila was carrying his child. Not when she was alone and probably struggling financially. Not when every day that passed brought her closer to her due date, as a date he'd calculated and recalculated until the numbers were burned into his brain. The breakthrough came from the most unlikely source. Detective Sarah Chen, the private investigator Evan had been working with, called him at 2:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in December, with excitement crackling in her voice. I found her, she said without preamble. Small town in upstate New York, called Pine Valley. She's been working at a diner called Maggie's Place, paying cash for a room above the restaurant. Evan was already reaching for his keys. Send me the address. Mr. Harper, wait. Detective Chen's voice carried a note of urgency that stopped him cold. There's something else. I spoke to the diner owner discreetly, and according to her, your girlfriend's pregnancy has been difficult high blood pressure, early contractions. She's been working double shifts to save money for medical bills. Terror crystallized in Evan's chest like ice. Is she okay? As of yesterday, yes. But Mr. Harper, she's due any day now. If you're going to do this, you need to go now. Evan was in his car before the call ended, GPS locked on Pine Valley, his heart hammering with a mixture of hope and fear that threatened to overwhelm him. The drive through the pre-dawn darkness felt endless, punctuated by the obsessive checking of his phone for updates from Detective Chen. Pine Valley was the kind of town that existed in postcard-lined streets, Victorian houses with wraparound porches, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and strangers stood out like neon signs. Maggie's Place sat on Main Street, between a used bookstore and a vintage clothing shop, its windows glowing warmly against the December cold. Evan parked across the street and sat for a moment, gathering his courage. Through the diner's front window, he could see the breakfast crowd farmers and shop owners starting their day with coffee and conversation, but no sign of Lila. The bell above the door chimed as Evan entered, and the comfortable hum of conversation faltered as every head turned to study the stranger in the expensive coat. The woman behind the counter 60-some, with gray hair and kind eyes approached with the weariness of someone protecting her own. Help you with something, hon? She asked. I'm looking for Lila Bennett, Evan said, his voice rough from the long drive. I'm the father of her baby." The woman's expression shifted from weariness to something like pity. "You're him. The one she's been crying over." Evan felt his chest tighten. "Is she here? Is she okay?" "She's upstairs." The woman, Maggie, presumably said quietly. "But Han, she's been through hell these past few months. Whatever you did to her, I let my family interfere with something beautiful," Evan said simply. "I let fear make me doubt the best thing that ever happened to me. I'm here to fix it." Maggie studied his face for a long moment, then nodded toward a door marked private. "Apartment 2, B. But if you hurt that girl again, you'll have me to answer to." Evan climbed the narrow staircase with his heart in his throat, each step bringing him closer to the moment he'd been dreaming of for 3 months. The hallway was dimly lit, smelling of coffee and bacon from the diner below. Apartment 2B had a simple wooden door with no decorations, no signs of the vibrant woman who lived behind it. Evan raised his hand to knock, then froze as he heard sounds from inside, a low, pained moan followed by sharp gasping. Ice shot through his veins as recognition hit him. Labor. Lila was in labor. "Lila!" Evan pounded on the door. "It's me. It's Evan. Go away." Lila's voice was strained with pain and fear. "You can't be here." "I'm not leaving," Evan said firmly, trying the door handle locked. "Lila, you're in labor. You need help." "I'm fine," she gasped. But another contraction cut off her words, leaving her crying out in pain. Evan didn't think. He stepped back and threw his shoulder against the door, using desperation and adrenaline to splinter the cheap wood around the lock. The door burst open, and Evan stumbled into a tiny studio apartment that broke his heart with its poverty: a futon bed, a hot plate, a mini fridge. And Lila, his beautiful, strong Lila, doubled over on the floor in obvious agony. She was heavily pregnant, her face pale and streaked with tears, her hands pressed against her swollen belly. "Lila," Evan breathed, dropping to his knees beside her. "How long have you been like this?" "Since midnight," she whispered, then grabbed his hand as another contraction seized her. "Evan, I'm scared. Something's wrong. There's blood." Evan looked down and felt his world tilt sideways. The towel beneath Lila was soaked with more blood than seemed safe, and her skin had a grayish pallor that screamed medical emergency. "We need to get you to a hospital," Evan said, already reaching for his phone. "No hospital," Lila said desperately. "I can't afford. I don't give a damn about money." Evan cut her off, dialing 911. "You're bleeding too much. Our baby." His voice broke on the words. "Our baby needs help." The 911 operator was professional and calm, but her questions filled Evan with increasing dread. How much blood? Was the baby moving? How far apart were the contractions? 20 minutes for an ambulance, the operator finally said. "There's a snowstorm moving through, and emergency vehicles are backed up." 20 minutes. Evan looked at Lila, who was growing paler by the second, and knew they didn't have 20 minutes. "I'm going to have to deliver the baby myself," he told the operator, his voice somehow steady despite the panic coursing through his veins. "Sir, are you medically trained?" "No, but I'm not letting my family die while we wait for help." For the next 30 minutes, Evan lived in a nightmare. Following the operator's instructions, he helped Lila through each contraction, his hands shaking as he tried to provide comfort while preparing towels and water. Lila gripped his fingers with superhuman strength, her nails leaving marks that Evan would wear like badges of honor. "I'm sorry," she gasped between contractions. "I'm sorry I ran. I'm sorry I didn't trust us." "Don't apologize," Evan said fiercely, stroking her hair back from her face. "You have nothing to be sorry for. I failed you. I let my parents poison what we had." "I love you," Lila whispered, her eyes bright with tears and pain. "I never stopped loving you." "I love you too," Evan replied, his own tears falling freely. "And I'm going to love our baby. We're going to be a family, Lila. Real family." The paramedics burst through the splintered door like angels of mercy. Just as Lila's labor intensified, their professional competence took over where Evan's desperate love left off, working with swift efficiency to stabilize both mother and baby. Contractions are coming fast, The lead paramedic announced as they prepared for transport, "We're going to deliver this baby right here." Evan held Lila's hand throughout the delivery, whispering words of love and encouragement as their son made his dramatic entrance into the world. When Benjamin Harper Bennett took his first breath and let out a strong, healthy cry, Evan sobbed with relief and overwhelming joy. "He's perfect," Lila whispered, exhausted but radiant as the paramedics placed their son on her chest. "Just like his mother," Evan said, leaning down to kiss her forehead while their baby boy gripped his finger with tiny, perfect hands. The ride to the hospital was a blur of sirens and monitors, and Evan's hand clasped tightly in Lila's as she drifted in and out of consciousness. Their son, Benjamin Evan, had decided, because he defended their love against all odds, slept peacefully in a specialized carrier, his tiny chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of life. In the hospital, after surgery to repair the internal bleeding that had nearly killed Lila, after hours of tests confirming that Benjamin was perfectly healthy despite his dramatic entrance, Evan finally allowed himself to breathe. He sat beside Lila's bed in the recovery room, Benjamin sleeping in his arms, and marveled at the completeness of his happiness. His son was perfect in fingers, 10 toes, and lungs that worked exactly as they should. Lila was alive and healing, her color already returning to normal. "We did it," Lila whispered, her voice weak, but her eyes bright as she watched Evan hold their son. "We're actually a family." "We are," Evan agreed, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "And I'm never letting either of you go again. My parents, the legal threats, all of it, none of it matters. All that matters is this." He gestured to encompass the three of them. This perfect triangle of love they'd created against all odds. "I want to marry you," Evan said suddenly. "Not because of any contract or arrangement, but because I can't imagine spending another day without you as my wife. Will you marry me, Lila Bennett?" Lila's smile was radiant despite her exhaustion. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes to everything. Yes to being your wife. Yes to being Benjamin's mother. Yes to the family we're going to build together." As Evan kissed the woman he loved while their son slept peacefully in his arms, he realized that sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the most unlikely arrangements. Sometimes, the best things in life come from the moments when you stop being afraid and start being brave. And sometimes, when you're willing to fight for love, love fights back twice as hard. They were home.